On September 1st, 1939, German guns opened fire on Poland at dawn. It was 4:45 in the morning. 12 years and 3 months later, in a bunker 50 feet underground, surrounded by rubble and smoke, with the roar of Soviet artillery rumbling over his head, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the mouth. Between those two moments, 70 million people died. This is not the story of a war. It is the story of its collapse. The collapse of a state built on terror and granite, on fanaticism and steel, on the conviction that it would last 1,000 years. What really lasted was 12. And the last months of those 12 years constitute one of the darkest episodes in human history. Columns of frozen refugees marching to nowhere, cities burning without anyone extinguishing them, a man locked underground who continued to move non-existent armies on a map stained with blood. We are going to follow it, day by day. The summer of 1944 was the turning point that many did not know how to see at the time. On the surface, Germany was still fighting on 3 fronts. Armaments production reports from Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, showed record figures. The total armaments production index reached 277 in 1944, compared with 223 in 1943. In November 1944, German industry was still manufacturing 1,253,000 Panzerfausts per month. But below those numbers, the mechanism was disintegrating. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. 3 weeks later, the Soviet armies launched Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, destroying Army Group Center in what was militarily the biggest German defeat of the war, greater even than Stalingrad. In a matter of weeks, Germany lost 28 infantry divisions, 47 generals captured, and 350,000 irreplaceable casualties. On July 20, 1944, a bomb exploded under Hitler's conference table at his headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. The attack missed by millimeters. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, the officer who placed the briefcase with the explosives, was shot that same night in the courtyard of the building on the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin, along with General Friedrich Olbricht and 2 other conspirators. The retaliation was ruthless. 5,000 people were executed in the following months. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of Staff, shot himself in his office. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most popular of the German military, was forced to commit suicide on October 14th. But the most important thing about what happened on July 20th was not the bomb. It was what he revealed about Hitler's mental state. Convinced that the generals were systematically betraying him, he closed himself even more in his delirious certainties. From that moment on, the situation meetings in the bunker ceased to be strategic discussions and became forced confession sessions where the generals competed to tell him what he wanted to hear. By the end of the summer of 1944, Anglo-American bombing had destroyed 35% of Germany's synthetic fuel production capacity. That was serious. But what proved decisive was what Speer described as the circulatory system of the economy, coal. The Ruhr, the industrial basin of Western Germany, produced the bulk of the Reich's steel and energy. Without coal, trains didn't work. Without trains, coal did not reach the factories. Without factories, tanks and planes were not produced. By the end of November 1944, the coal wagons were no longer reaching their destinations. The Gauleiters, regional governors of the party, confiscated them directly on the tracks for their own needs. On November 11, 1944, Speer sent Hitler an alarm note beginning with these words: "The cessation of production in the Rhine-Westphalia industrial area is intolerable for the entire German economy and for the successful conduct of the war." The Ruhr front had been paralyzed by shelling for more than 6 weeks. Hospitals were beginning to run out of fuel to warm up. Gas and electricity only worked during restricted hours. Berlin's buildings remained unheated. Hitler read the report. He did not give any orders. Meanwhile, in the east, General Heinz Guderian, Chief of Army Staff, brought detailed maps from General Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Eastern Intelligence, showing the concentration of Soviet forces on the Vistula front to headquarters in January 1945. The Red Army had 180 divisions ready for the attack. In some sectors, the superiority of forces was 15-1. Guderian called it a ticking time bomb. Hitler looked at the maps and declared them to be utterly idiotic. He ordered that the officer who had prepared them be committed to an insane asylum. "If you want General Gehlen to be committed to an insane asylum," Guderian replied, "then you will have to commit me as well." It was January 9th, 1945. In 3 days, the largest Soviet offensive of the war would begin. The thermometer was 15 degrees below zero at dawn on January 12, 1945, when Soviet guns opened fire on the Vistula riverfront. General Ivan Konev launched his armies from the Baranov Head Bridge, south of Warsaw. The rumble was audible 100 kilometers away. Before the day was out, the German defensive line had collapsed on a front of 300 kilometers. To the north, Marshal Georgy Zhukov crossed the Vistula north and south of Warsaw. The Polish capital fell on January 17th. It was a city of rubble. 2 years earlier, Hitler had ordered it to be razed to the ground in retaliation for the uprising of the Jewish ghetto. Further north, 2 Soviet armies swept through half of East Prussia and reached the Gulf of Danzig, cutting off the province from the rest of the Reich. The cities of Königsberg and Danzig, with their centuries of Germanic history, were encircled. The advance was of a speed that the Soviet generals themselves described as astonishing. In 15 days, Marshal Zhukov traveled 220 kilometers and reached the Oder River. Only 100 kilometers separated his tanks from Berlin. Guderian described the effect in a nutshell. The Soviet storm was taking on for us the proportions of a complete disaster. What no one on the outside could see clearly was what that advance meant in human terms, on the ground. East Prussia had been one of the historical centers of Prussian and German power. Families had been there for generations. When Soviet armies cut off evacuation routes, hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped. Those who managed to escape did so in columns marching across the ice of the Baltic Sea in temperatures of up to 20 degrees below zero, with children in their arms and what they could drag in carts. The cars were breaking. The children died of cold. Soviet bombing dissolved the columns into chaos. Albert Speer had these columns photographed during his trips to the front in January and February. He took the photographs to Hitler, who pushed them out of his sight without looking at them. Speer wrote in his memoirs, "It was impossible to say whether he did not want to see them or whether they affected him too much." Years later, at the Nuremberg trial, he would add, "He just pushed them aside on the map table." On January 30th, 1945, the exact anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power, Speer handed the Führer a 12-page memorandum. The first line read, "The war is lost." Hitler kept it in his safe without reading it. In February 1945, as the Anglo-American armies closed in on the Rhine and the Soviets consolidated their position on the Oder, the Reich machine began to work inwards, like a cog that can no longer move anywhere else. On February 8th, Eisenhower's armies, 85 divisions at the time, began closing ranks on the Rhine. Hitler ordered the German armies not to retreat to the other side of the river. The result was predictable. In 6 weeks, Germany lost 350,000 more men, killed, wounded and captured, with 293,000 prisoners. They also lost most of the weaponry. There was no material to replace it. Meanwhile, in the weeks of February, Hitler was hardening his stance towards the Allied prisoners of war. At a meeting on February 19th, he considered Goebbels' proposal to denounce the Geneva Convention and summarily shoot all captured Allied airmen in retaliation for the bombing of German cities. When some of the officers present pointed out the legal problems, Hitler replied, "To hell with that. If I make it clear that I will not contemplate any consideration for the prisoners, but will treat them without any consideration of their rights, regardless of reprisals, then more than one will think twice before deserting." Dönitz replied the next day that the disadvantages would outweigh the advantages, and that it would be better to keep up appearances while the measures deemed necessary were discreetly carried out. Hitler reluctantly agreed. The violence was not only on paper. Several Allied airmen who parachuted over German territory were lynched by the civilian population, incited by the orders of the regime itself. A French general taken prisoner, Mesny, was deliberately killed on Hitler's orders. Thousands of Allied prisoners of war died during the long forced marches into the interior of the country without food or water, while guards kept them moving to prevent them from being released by advancing armies. On March 7th, a vanguard of the American 9th Armored Division reached the heights above Remagen on the Rhine, 25 kilometers south of Koblenz. To the amazement of the tank crews, the Ludendorff railway bridge was still standing. American engineers cut the detonation cables they found. A section of infantry ran across. The bridge shook when some charges exploded, but it resisted. By sunset, the Americans had a solid bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. Hitler ordered the execution of 8 officers responsible for failing to blow up the bridge in time. A special tribunal presided over by the fanatical General Hübner tried them in hours and shot them. It was a measure that spread terror among middle managers for weeks. The Remagen shock, as Model called it, kept many responsible officers in a state of panic that paralyzed them from making any decisions that could be construed as disobedience. In the same context of institutionalized reprisals, executions of soldiers accused of desertion intensified. On February 12th, Field Marshal Keitel signed, in the name of the Führer, an order sentencing to death any soldier who obtained fraudulent permits or traveled with false documentation. On March 5th, General Blaskowitz, commander of Army Group H in the West, ordered that any soldier found far from his unit be summarily tried and shot on the spot. Many were. The war against the army itself was already underway. By the end of March, the situation on the Rhine was irreversible. On March 22nd to March 23rd, General Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, in a night operation that surprised the Germans with no organized resistance. At the Situation meeting on March 23rd at 2:30 a.m., when a general raised the possibility of sending reinforcements to the bridge, an aide replied that at that time he had 5 damaged tank destroyers at the Seine training range, which could be ready for combat in the coming days. Patton already had a bridgehead 7 miles wide and 6 miles deep by this time, with armor advancing toward Frankfurt. But what was to mark the end of any possibility of coherent defense were not bridges or armies. It was a decree signed in Berlin on March 19, 1945. It is known as the Nero Decree, although Hitler never called it that. The text was concise and total. All military, transport, communications, industrial and supply installations, as well as all resources within the Reich which the enemy may use, either immediately or in the foreseeable future to continue the war, shall be destroyed. Everything. Bridges, railways, canals, ships, locomotives, freight cars, food depots, gas, water and electricity installations. The coal mines flooded, the warehouses burned, the factories blown up. Germany would be turned into a desert. The decree was supplemented the next day by an instruction from Bormann on evacuation. Millions of people from the western and eastern territories of the Reich were to be mobilized on foot into the interior of the country, including forced foreign laborers and prisoners of war. No supplies had been arranged to feed them or accommodation to receive them. In practice, as Speer explained in Nuremberg, it was a starvation sentence for millions of people. Bormann's decree ordered the Gauleiters that, if no transport was available, the male part of the population should march on foot. Speer read the decree and understood at once what it meant. It was not a military measure. It was the planned extermination of the survival conditions of the German people. He calculated the consequences in precise technical terms. Without electricity, factories and hospitals were paralyzed. Without gas, homes were left without heating and cooking in the middle of winter. Without clean water, epidemics would begin. Without bridges and railways, coal could not be distributed. Without coal, steel mill furnaces would shut down forever because a stopped blast furnace that cools completely takes months to restart and suffers irreversible damage to the inner lining. Germany's post-war economic recovery would be delayed not by years, but by decades. In some industrial regions, perhaps forever. On March 18th, the night before the decree was signed, Speer personally presented Hitler with a 22-page memorandum. He had drafted it in the previous days with brutal clarity. The German economy would collapse in 4 to 8 weeks. Coal production, already at a fifth of normal, could not be maintained. The fronts could not be sustained without ammunition. The war was lost. No one had the right to destroy what the German people would need to survive. So that Hitler could read it without rejecting it out of hand, Speer began the first pages in the usual tone of coal production reports, with figures and technical graphs. Only on the second page did the text take a turn. The final collapse of the German economy could be expected, with certainty, in 4 to 8 weeks. After that, the war cannot be continued even on the military level, and then appealing directly to Hitler by name. No one has the right to take the view that the fate of the German people is bound up with his own. Speer had taken precautions before handing it over. He asked Colonel von Below, his liaison at headquarters, to make a summary for Hitler at a propitious time. He also asked Julius Schaub, Hitler's personal aide, to tell the Führer that he wanted a photograph dedicated to him for his approaching 40th birthday. It was the only way to ensure that Hitler received him with some favorable disposition before reading the document. Hitler received him in the bunker that evening and handed him, with unusually cordial birthday wishes, the photograph in its red leather box emblazoned with the Führer's emblem. The inscription was almost illegible. His hand trembled constantly, but the words were affectionate, promising a lasting friendship. Speer thanked him and handed him the memo. Hitler read it without saying anything. As Speer was already leaving the door, the Führer spoke in a cold, curt voice that Speer would never forget. If the war is lost, the nation will also be lost. There is no need to worry about the foundations that the German people will need to continue a primitive existence. On the contrary, it will be better to destroy even those things, because the nation has proven to be the weakest, and the future belongs exclusively to the strongest nation in the East. Moreover, those who remain after the battle are only the inferior, for the good ones have already been killed. Speer heard that sentence, picked up his papers, and went straight to the Chancellor's bunker to draft the decree implementing the Nero decree, trying to empty it of content without Hitler noticing. The decree of March 19th was followed on the 27th of the same month by implementation instructions for the communications installations, the entire telegraph and telephone network of the Reich, the switching exchanges, the poles, the antennas, the radio stations, the reserve equipment, the plans of the cables, the diagrams of installations. Everything was to be totally disabled by explosion, fire, or demolition. Even the technical documents that would allow for future repair had to be destroyed so that the enemy could not restore communications in the occupied territories. It was, in practical terms, the destruction of a nation's nervous system. What Albert Speer did in the weeks that followed was an operation of covert disobedience that is unprecedented in the history of the Third Reich. Immediately after signing the document implementing the Nero decree, which ostensibly carried out Hitler's orders but effectively hollowed them out, Speer deployed motorcyclists, cars and messengers in the early morning hours of March 30th to distribute instructions contrary to Hitler's before the Gauleiters could act. Their argument was technical. The decree allowed the facilities to be disabled instead of destroying them. An engineer could remove key parts from a piece of machinery instead of blowing it up. A bridge could be temporarily paralyzed rather than demolished. In theory, the facilities could be recovered when those areas were reconquered, although everyone knew that there would be no reconquest. He personally toured the Ruhr, Palatinate, Rhineland, Westphalia, and Württemberg. In each region, he summoned industrial leaders and military commanders. Some listened to him. The Gauleiter of the Palatinate, Stör, refused to carry out the evacuations and took personal responsibility. SS General Hauser decided that demolition orders could not be enforced. Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, promised to keep the combat as far away from the industrial installations as possible. He also acted with the money. On February 14th, he had offered to the Minister of Finance, Count Schwerin von Krosigk, the entirety of the increase in his personal fortune since 1933 to help stabilize the framework. Goebbels blocked the initiative. On April 3rd, Speer sent a circular to all his offices throughout the Reich. There is no scorched earth. All installations and plants must be disabled so that the enemy does not derive any additional military potential from them. But there was a problem. Martin Bormann, party secretary and the man closest to Hitler in those last days, was informed of Speer's activities. On March 27th, Speer was summoned to Hitler's office in the bunker. Hitler received him coldly, without shaking his hand. Bormann has given me a report on his conference with the Gauleiters of the Ruhr. He has pushed for my orders not to be carried out and has declared that the war is lost. Are you aware of what should follow from that? There was a silence. Then Hitler added, in a voice that had become almost soft, "If you were not my architect, I would take the appropriate measures in that case." Speer impulsively replied, "Take whatever steps you think are necessary and don't treat me in a special way as an individual." Hitler stared at him. He told her to take sick leave. Speer refused. The exchange lasted almost an hour. In the end, Hitler asked him if he could at least hope that the war could still be won. Speer did not answer. Hitler gave him 24 hours to reconsider. That night, in an emergency apartment in the back wing of the ministry at Pariser Platz, Speer wrote a letter. It was the most difficult of his life. He closed it not with the usual "Heil, mein Führer," but with these words, "May God protect Germany." When he was called back to Hitler the next day, he had no ready answer. He left it to the inspiration of the moment. "Mein Führer," he said, "I stand unconditionally behind you." Hitler was visibly moved. Her eyes filled with tears, something that happened frequently in those days. "Then all is well," he replied. He shook his hand. Speer took advantage of the moment to regain oversight of the implementation of the decree. He got it, and he never gave the orders for total destruction that the decree demanded. 5 years later, at the Nuremberg trial, Prosecutor Jackson would ask him about all this. Speer openly acknowledged that he had committed acts of high treason according to the laws of the Reich. He was the only defendant to do so. He received 20 years in prison. To say that Speer saved Germany's industrial infrastructure for post-war reconstruction is probably an exaggeration. The Allies advanced so fast that many demolitions proved impossible to carry out simply because there was no time. But in the Ruhr, in the Rhineland, in the Palatinate, there were factories, bridges and power stations that remained intact because someone physically stood between the order and the explosion. To understand the collapse of January 1945, it is necessary to go back to the autumn of the previous year. In mid-October 1944, Hitler called General Speer aside during a situation conference and secretly revealed to him that he was planning a major offensive in the West, concentrating all available forces. The target was Antwerp, the Allies' key supply port in Belgium. If they managed to take it, the supply of the Anglo-American armies would be cut off for weeks, and it would be possible to encircle the entire English army. Speer said there were hardly any trucks left. Hitler replied, "Everything else must be set aside for the benefit of this." On December 16, 1944, the offensive began in the icy mists of the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The Germans managed to surprise 4 weak American divisions. The SS massacred 71 unarmed American prisoners of war in a snowy field near Malmedy on December 17th in what would become known as the Malmedy Massacre. The offensive advanced for a few days. Bastogne, an essential road junction for the Ardennes front, was surrounded. SS General Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Armored Army, demanded the surrender of the city. American General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single word: nuts. or, in the translation that the Germans tried to decipher, something that implied an absolute rejection. On December 23rd, the weather improved, the clouds dissipated, Allied fighter bombers filled the sky. Field Marshal Model told Hitler that the offensive had definitely failed. Hitler ordered it to continue. Speer spent the last days of December touring the Ardennes front. He visited General Sepp Dietrich at his headquarters near Houffalize, Belgium. Dietrich was one of the few old fighters in the party who had distanced himself psychologically from Hitler. "We cannot convince the Führer that these are tough soldiers as good as ours," he told him. In addition, we did not receive ammunition. Supply routes have been cut off by airstrikes. Speer lived that night under bombardment. Allied four-engine formations passed over the headquarters. Engines roared. Bombs fell. The sky lit up red and yellow. There was no anti-aircraft defense. The return trip from the front to Hitler's headquarters took 22 hours to cover just over 300 kilometers. The roads were saturated with vehicles, artillery, wounded. Allied fighters patrolled by day, making movement impossible. One could only advance at night without lights, looking for the edge of the road with half-closed eyelids. On the evening of December 31st, Speer arrived at Hitler's headquarters in Bad Nauheim to wish him a happy new year. In the bunker, Hitler toasted with champagne. He was euphoric without having drunk anything. He made optimistic forecasts for 1945. His circle listened to him in silence. Only Bormann enthusiastically seconded him. Its magnetic power was still operational, Speer would later write. It was no longer possible to produce conviction by rational arguments. It was January 1st, 1945. There were 4 months left of the war. The capital of the Reich in the first quarter of 1945 was a city that burned slowly but steadily, like a bonfire that no one can extinguish because no one feeds it with anything useful. Allied bombing had begun in earnest in 1943 and had never stopped. In August 1943, the RAF had destroyed the center of Hamburg in a series of attacks that generated a firestorm, a column of hot air that sucked up all the fuel for several kilometers around. The temperature at the epicenter reached 800 degrees Celsius. 45,000 people died in 1 week. Berlin did not suffer a firestorm like Hamburg, but the attacks were piling up. The night sky over the capital shone frequently. The Chancellor, the entire Wilhelmstrasse, the Hotel Adlon were progressively reduced to broken facades. Berliners got used to basements, shelters, to going down quickly when the sirens sounded. The windows disappeared from the offices, replaced by planks or simply opened to the cold air. By January 1945, the situation had become permanent. There was no electricity or gas, except during restricted hours. The buildings had no heating. The supply of coal depended on trains that were late if they arrived. The city functioned with an emergency rationality that mixed routine with horror. And yet Berlin was still the seat of the Reich government, the place where Hitler made decisions, the center toward which the strings of power of a crumbling state converged. The Chancellery continued to function, although its large marble rooms were no longer suitable for situation conferences. Beginning in February, Hitler held his military meetings in his study office in the deep bunker, 12 meters underground. The room was barely what was necessary. The marble table came from Austria. It was red, with beige veins of an ancient fossilized coral reef. The generals lined up by the windows, Hitler sitting in front of them. Those who saw him for the first time in those months were impressed or horrified by his appearance. A young army captain who saw him in February 1945 described him as follows. His head was shaking slightly, his left arm hung limp and his hand trembled considerably. His eyes had an indescribable flicker which created a terrifying and completely unnatural effect. His face and the parts around his eyes gave the impression of total exhaustion. All his movements were those of a senile man. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician since 1936, injected him daily with a cocktail of drugs and stimulants that included amphetamine derivatives, intravenous glucose, ox liver extract, and other preparations of dubious medical efficacy. On July 20th, 1944, the explosion of the Stauffenberg bomb had burst his eardrums and left him with dizzying fits. Throughout the autumn of 1944, he suffered a nervous breakdown that forced him to stay in bed for several weeks. But it was still standing, and he kept moving armies on maps. The problem was that many of these armies no longer existed in practice. The German front was a cartographic illusion. Lines on paper representing units that on the ground consisted of fragments of divisions, battalions without artillery, companies of men without ammunition. At the Situation Conference on March 23, 1945, when a general raised the issue of the Indian Legion, Indian soldiers captured and conscripted into the German army, Hitler replied, "The Indian Legion is a joke. There are Indians who would not kill a louse, who would prefer to be eaten, nor will they kill an Englishman. If we used them to spin prayer wheels or something, they would be the most indefatigable soldiers in the world." The meeting lasted until 3:43 a.m. What the war maps could not show was what was happening on the roads. Since the Soviet armies crossed the Reich border in early 1945, one of the largest population exodus in European history began. The most widely accepted estimates indicate that more than 12 million Germans fled or were expelled from the eastern regions between January 1945 and the end of the war, from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, Sudetenland, the Baltic territories. Many had hours to decide. The Soviet soldiers were advancing with a speed that exceeded the forecasts of even the German commanders themselves. A family in Königsberg could go to bed knowing that the front was 80 kilometers away and wake up hearing the cannon on the outskirts of the city. The columns of refugees that Speer photographed in January 1945 were images of a society that was disintegrating in movement. Women with children in their arms, old people pulling handcarts, Labradors with their horses dragging sleighs loaded with mattresses and jars of jam and framed photographs. The icy ground sounded like wood under the wheels. The wounded who could not walk were left behind. In East Prussia, those who took too long to escape by land tried to cross the Baltic Sea, which in the winter of 1945 had frozen over the Frisian area. The columns marched on the ice in temperatures of 20 degrees below zero. Soviet planes were bombing the ice. The bombs broke it. Trucks, horses, people fell into the water at 0 degrees and disappeared in seconds. The greatest single disaster occurred on January 30th, 1945, the 12th anniversary of Hitler's coming to power. The troop transport Wilhelm Gustloff, adapted as a civilian and military evacuation vessel, set sail from the port of Gdynia, overloaded with more than 10,000 people. The exact figure varies according to sources between 9,000 and 10,000. 4,000 of them were women, children, and wounded. A Soviet submarine launched 3 torpedoes. The ship sank in 45 minutes. Between 9,000 and 9,400 people died. First responders rescued 838. It was, and still is, the largest shipwreck in history in terms of human casualties. The Gauleiter of Danzig, Albert Forster, had banned civilian evacuation for weeks, fearing that it would be interpreted as a sign of defeat. When he finally allowed the exit, it was too late for many. Those waiting on the docks in Danzig under Soviet artillery fire described scenes that survivors compared to the apocalypse. Screams in the dark, pushing, people being trampled underfoot, ships setting sail crammed together while thousands of others were left ashore. Hitler refused to see the photographs of the refugees that Speer brought him. He pushed them on the table without looking at them. On March 19th, while signing the Nero Decree, his reaction to the fate of the civilian population was defined by a phrase he had uttered earlier that month to Kesselring. "We can no longer afford to worry about the population." On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler turned 56. The party was held in the bunker. All those who remained arrived. Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, Ribbentrop, Bormann, and the surviving soldiers, Dönitz, Keitel, Jodl, the new chief of the General Staff Krebs, they offered their congratulations to the Führer. The rooms smelled of damp concrete and unlit cigarettes. Above them, on the surface, the roar of Soviet artillery was already clearly audible from Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's armies had crossed the Oder and reached the suburbs of the capital on April 21st, the day after the birthday. At the situation meeting that followed the birthday celebration, the generals explained to the Führer that the escape corridors to the south would be closed in a matter of days. They urged Hitler to leave Berlin and head for the so-called National Redoubt in the Bavarian Alps. Most ministries had already moved south with their trucks loaded with documents and frantic officials. Hitler hesitated. He could not quite accept that the capital of the Reich was about to fall into the hands of the same Soviets whose army he had declared destroyed years before. As a concession to the generals, he consented to establish two separate commands in case the Americans and Soviets were united on the Elbe. Dönitz would lead the north and Kesselring the south. That same night, the first great exodus of the hierarchs, Göring left in a caravan of truckloads of loot from Karinhall, his estate. Himmler quietly disappeared to the north. Ribbentrop vanished as well. None of them would ever see Hitler alive again. On April 21st, Hitler ordered a full-scale attack on the Soviet armies in the southern suburbs of Berlin by General Felix Steiner's SS. Every available soldier in the Berlin area was to be thrown into the counterattack. Any commander who retains his forces, he shouted to General Koller, who represented the Luftwaffe, will lose his life in 5 hours. You yourself will answer with your head that you are getting into the last man. Steiner's attack never took place, not because Steiner deliberately disobeyed, though he did, but because the army did not exist in practice. The units that were supposed to participate were scattered, unarmed, or simply could not be located. On April 22nd, at the 3 o'clock Situation Conference, Hitler demanded news of Steiner's counterattack. No one had any, and the generals had to inform him that the withdrawal of troops from North Berlin to support Steiner had so weakened the front that the Soviets had broken through the lines, and their tanks were already within the city limits. It was the biggest outburst of anger of Hitler's life. He shouted that everyone had betrayed him, that there was nothing but treason, lies, corruption, and cowardice, that he was finished, that he would stay in Berlin, that there he would meet his end. Witnesses who were present, among them General Berger of the SS, who had come to the bunker earlier that day, described the Führer almost identically. His face changed to a purplish red. His hand trembled, his leg trembled, his head trembled. Berger thought he would have a stroke at any moment. That afternoon, Hitler called Goebbels and invited his entire family, his wife Magda and 6 children, aged 3 to 12, to take up residence in the bunker. What happened in the hours following the April 22nd outbreak was a final demonstration of how power worked within the Third Reich. Göring, in the Obersalzberg of Berchtesgaden, received news of Hitler's status by telephone through General Eckhard Christian. He summoned a legal advisor, searched his safe for the decree Hitler had signed on June 29, 1941, designating him as successor in the event of the Führer's incapacity, and carefully drafted a telegram. The text was almost ridiculous in its formulation. My Führer, in view of your decision to remain in the fortress of Berlin, do you agree that I should at once assume full command of the Reich with full freedom of action at home and abroad as your deputy, in accordance with your decree of June 29, 1941? If I do not receive an answer by 10 o'clock tonight, I will assume that he has lost his freedom of action, and I will consider the conditions of his decree as fulfilled, and I will act in the best interest of our country and our people. The telegram arrived in the bunker and was intercepted by Martin Bormann, who presented it to Hitler as an ultimatum and an attempt at usurpation. Hitler broke out again. He dictated a telegram informing Göring that he had committed high treason, although for his long years of service, his life would be spared if he immediately resigned from all his posts. Bormann, on his own, sent a radio telegram to the SS in the Berchtesgaden, ordering the immediate arrest of Göring, his general staff, and Minister Lammers. That same night, April 23rd, far from the Berlin bunker, at the Swedish consulate in Lübeck, Heinrich Himmler met with the Swedish Count Volker Bernadotte. Himmler had sent the Count a concrete proposal. Germany was ready to surrender to the Western Allies. In the East, however, the war would continue until the Western powers took over from the front against the Soviets. The proposal was absurd in strategic terms, but it revealed the extent to which the man who had built the concentration camp system, who had overseen the murder of 6 million Jews, who had always presented himself as the most loyal of the Nazi hierarchs, was already thinking about his own future. Bernadotte asked Himmler to put the offer in writing. The letter was drafted by candlelight. An RAF bombing raid had cut off Lübeck's electricity. Himmler signed it. The news reached the bunker through a BBC broadcast picked up by the Ministry of Propaganda's listening service. Heinz Lorenz, one of Goebbels' aides, ran across the grenade-shattered square to the bunker with a copy for the minister and the Führer. The reaction, according to Hanna Reich, the test pilot who was in the bunker, was men and women alike screamed in rage, fear and despair, all mixed up in an emotional spasm. Hitler's was the worst. His colour, Reich recalled, rose to a fiery red and his face was practically unrecognizable. Göring had at least asked the Führer for permission to take command. Himmler had asked for nothing. He had contacted the enemy behind his back. This, Hitler said, was the worst act of treason I had ever known. Fegelein, Himmler's liaison in the bunker, was taken from his guard cell and taken to the Chancellery garden. He was shot without trial. In the darkest hours of April 28th, with Soviet tanks advancing along the Saarlandstrasse a few hundred meters from the Chancellery, Hitler made his last decisions. He summoned a municipal official of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, named Walter Wagner, who was fighting a few blocks away at the time, and made him cross the square under the grenades to the bunker. In the small conference room at 2 o'clock in the morning on April 29, 1945, Wagner celebrated the marriage ceremony between Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. Eva Braun was 33 years old. For 12 years, she had been Hitler's secret mistress. Confined to her villa of Berghof on the Obersalzberg, watching movies, skiing, waiting, it had never been presented in public. No one outside the inner circle knew of his existence. He had attempted suicide twice in the 1930s out of desperation at the loneliness of his situation. Now he had arrived in Berlin of his own volition on April 15th to share the finale. It wouldn't be right for a real German, he had told Hanna Reich. On the marriage form, she began signing her maiden name, Eva Braun, stopped, crossed out the B and wrote Eva Hitler, born Braun. Goebbels and Bormann signed as witnesses. After the ceremony, a macabre wedding breakfast, champagne, secretaries, the vegetarian cook. Hitler talked for hours about the old days, about the comrades of better days. He then retired to another room and dictated his political and personal will to his secretary Gertrude Junger. The political testament began with a monumental lie. It is false that I or anyone else in Germany wanted war in 1939, and ended with a call to perpetuate racial laws and to mercilessly resist the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry. He blamed everything on the Jews, on the treacherous generals, on the cowardice of others. He learned nothing. He appointed as successor Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as Reich President and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party. He appointed Goebbels Reich Chancellor and Bormann Party Minister, a new position. He did not mention Speer. In his personal will, he finally acknowledged that he was marrying Eva Braun, she who after many years of true friendship came to this city already almost besieged of her own free will to share my fate. He ordered that his remains and those of his wife be cremated. He asked that his property, insofar as it had any value, should pass to the party or to the state, or if the state also ceased to exist, that no further instructions were needed. 3 copies of the document came out of the bunker at dawn, carried by 3 messengers who were to cross Soviet lines to carry them to Dönitz, Schörner, and the historical archives. One of the messengers, Major Johann Meyer, finally buried his copy in the garden of his house in Iserlohn, Westphalia. Another, Wilhelm Zander, Bormann's deputy, hid his in a trunk in the Bavarian village of Tegernsee. Only the indiscretion of the third messenger, journalist Heinz Lorenz, allowed these documents to eventually be discovered. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Berlin, General Wenck, whose army was supposed to come to the aid of the capital, was confronted with a military situation that made any relief impossible. His army had been practically liquidated. The 9th Army east of Berlin had also disappeared. General Heinrici, to the north, was rapidly retreating westward to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. There were soldiers of the Volkssturm, 15 and 16 years old, with a Panzerfaust and a pistol, defending the approaches to the Chancellery. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, the Situation Conference was the last to be held in the bunker. General Weidling, who commanded the defenders of Berlin, an army of old men from the Volkssturm and teenagers from the Hitler Youth, reported that the Soviets had advanced during the night to Saarlandstrasse and Wilhelmstrasse, almost to the Air Ministry, a few blocks from the Chancellery. The enemy would reach the Foreign Ministry on May 1st at the latest. Hitler ate his last meal with his 2 secretaries and with the vegetarian cook, Fräulein Manziali. Outside in the garden, Erich Kempka, the driver, gathered 200 litres of petrol. He had managed to collect 180 and had them carried to the emergency exit of the bunker. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun said goodbye to those present. Goebbels, General Krebs, General Burgdorf, the secretaries, the cook. Frau Goebbels did not appear. He was in his room, facing what he had promised to do with his 6 children. Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their rooms. In the corridor, Goebbels, Bormann, and several others waited. A few minutes later, a gunshot. They waited for a second. There was only silence. They entered the Führer's apartments. Adolf Hitler lay on the sofa, dripping with blood. He had shot himself in the mouth. At his side, Eva Braun. 2 revolvers had fallen to the ground, but she hadn't used hers. He had swallowed poison. It was 3:30 in the afternoon of Monday, April 30th, 1945, 10 days after his 56th birthday, 12 years and 3 months exactly since he had become Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's assistant, SS Sturmbannführer Heinz Linger, and an orderly carried out the Führer's body wrapped in a grey army field blanket covering the mangled face. From the black pants and shoes sticking out of the blanket, Kempka recognized it was him. Eva Braun was taken by Bormann as she was, with no visible injuries, in a dark dress. The bodies were deposited in a shrapnel pit in the garden and soaked in gasoline. Attendees, Goebbels, Bormann, and others, retreated to the protection of the emergency portal and raised their right arms in the Nazi farewell salute as the flames grew. Soviet grenades kept falling in the garden. The ceremony lasted just 1 minute. The charred bones were never found. The Soviets searched for them for days. The artillery continued to fall on the garden without interruption, and if any remains remained, the constant fire disintegrated them. This fact fueled rumors for decades that Hitler had survived. The unanimous testimony of several witnesses present, questioned separately by British and American intelligence services, dispelled any reasonable doubt. On the night of April 30th to May 1st, 500 or 600 people, mostly members of the SS, crowded into the subway tunnels under the Chancellery, preparing for mass escape across Soviet lines. Bormann had not yet been able to confirm Hitler's death to Dönitz. He continued to send ambiguous messages. Finally, Goebbels solved it with a last radio telegram to the Admiral at 3:15 in the afternoon of May 1st. The Führer died yesterday at 3:30 p.m. The testament of April 29th designates him as President of the Reich. Goebbels did not consider it necessary to report his own intentions. That same afternoon, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda brought their 6 children: 12-year-old Helga, Hilde, 11, Helmut, 9, Holder, 7, Hedda, 5, and Heide, 3, to the bunker medical barracks. A doctor administered lethal injections. There is a discrepancy in the sources as to whether the injections were given while they were sleeping or while they were conscious. The fact itself is established by multiple testimonies. Goebbels called his assistant, SS Hauptsturmführer Günther Schwegemann, asked for petrol and told him that he was going to die along with his wife. At 8:30 p.m., the doctor and Frau Goebbels left the bunker, walked down the corridor saying goodbye to those they found, and went up to the Chancellery garden. An SS orderly shot them in the back of the head at their request. 4 cans of gasoline were poured over their bodies, and it was set on fire. The cremation was incomplete. The Soviets found the charred bodies the next day and immediately identified them. At 9 o'clock that night, the bunker was set on fire. The evasion was chaos. The plan was to cross on foot to Friedrichstrasse station through the metro tunnels and then advance north via Soviet lines. Some succeeded. Bormann tried to follow a German tank which was hit by a Soviet shell. Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth, who had abandoned his battalion of teenagers on the Pickelsdorf bridge to save his own skin, later saw Bormann's body lying under a bridge where the Invalidenstrasse crosses the railway tracks. Moonlight illuminated his face. There were no signs of external injuries. Bormann was presumed to have swallowed his cyanide capsule when he realized that he could not cross the lines. Generals Krebs and Bergdorf did not attempt to escape. It is believed that they shot themselves in the basement of the new Chancellery. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz received Bormann's message on the night of April 30th without knowing for sure whether Hitler had died. "The Führer designates you as his successor," the message read, without further ado. Dönitz responded, believing that Hitler was still alive, pledging unconditional loyalty. When Goebbels finally informed him of his death, Dönitz spoke on the radio at 10:20 p.m. on May 1st. He lied about the manner of his death. He said that the Führer had fallen fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism. In reality, he had committed suicide in his bunker. But the lie was necessary so as not to disappoint the soldiers who were still fighting. The Dönitz government settled in Flensburg on the Danish border. Their main objective was to negotiate, not a total surrender, but something more favorable, what Jodl called buying time to move as many German troops and refugees as possible out of the way of the Soviets so that they could surrender to the Western Allies. In other words, to continue fighting the East while negotiating peace with the West. Eisenhower saw the game from the get-go. When Admiral Hans von Friedeberg and then General Jodl arrived at their headquarters in Reims to negotiate, Eisenhower sent them a message through General Badel-Smith. If they did not immediately cease all pretext and delay, he would close the entire Allied front and forcibly prevent more German troops from entering his lines. On May 7, 1945, at 1:30 a.m., Dönitz gave Jodl full powers over the radio to sign the unconditional surrender. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, in a small red school in Reims, where Eisenhower had his headquarters, Germany surrendered unconditionally. General Walter Bedell-Smith signed for the Allies, General Ivan Suslopurov as a witness for Russia, General François Sévez for France, Admiral Friedeberg and General Jodl signed for Germany. Jodl asked permission to say a few words, and it was granted. With this signing, the German people and the German armed forces are handed over, for better or worse, into the hands of the victors. At this hour, I can only express the hope that the victor will treat them generously. There was no response from the Allied side. The guns in Europe stopped firing and the bombs stopped falling at midnight on May 8th to 9th, 1945. A strange and welcome silence fell over the continent for the first time since September 1st, 1939. In the 5 years, 8 months and 7 days that had elapsed, Tens of millions of men and women had been killed on 100 battlefields and in thousands of bombed cities, and millions more executed in Nazi gas chambers or in the graves of SS Einsatzgruppen in Russia and Poland. Berlin was smoking. The Reichstag was on fire. The streets smelled of death and damp debris in the warm May sun. The Reich survived the death of its founder by exactly 7 days. Dönitz's government in Flensburg was dissolved on 23 May 1945 when the Allies surrounded it and arrested all its members. Himmler took a little longer to fall. After Dönitz excluded him from the government on May 6th, the former Reichsführer SS that had held the power of life and death over millions of people throughout Europe wandered around Flensburg for 2 weeks. On 21st May, with 11 SS officers, he attempted to cross the British and American lines on his way to Bavaria. He had shaved his moustache, put a black patch over his left eye, and was wearing the uniform of an army private. The group was arrested on the first day at a British checkpoint between Hamburg and Bremerhaven. After being interrogated, Himmler confessed his identity to a captain in the British Army. He was transferred to the 2nd Army headquarters in Lüneburg. They stripped him naked and searched to avoid any possibility that he was carrying poison hidden in his clothes. But the record was not thorough. Himmler had a vial of potassium cyanide stored in a gum cavity. When a second British intelligence officer, arriving from Montgomery's headquarters, ordered a military doctor to examine his mouth on May 23rd, Himmler bit into the vial. He died within 12 minutes, despite frantic attempts to keep him alive by pumping his stomach and administering emetics. Goering was captured by the Americans, who found him in his retreat at Berchtesgaden. 80 pounds thinner than the last time he had been seen, he was transferred to Nuremberg prison. He was sentenced to death at the trial. 2 hours before his turn on the gallows, he swallowed a vial of poison that someone had managed to smuggle into his cell. As his Führer, and as his rival for succession, he chose the mode of his own death. Of the 10 sentenced to be hanged in the early hours of October 16, 1946 in Nuremberg, all went up to the gallows. Ribbentrop first, followed by Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Seyss, Inquart, Saukel, and Jodl. 7 defendants received prison sentences: Hess, Raeder, and Funk for life, Speer and von Schirach 20 years, von Neurath 15, Dönitz 10. Imagine walking through Berlin in May 1945. The streets do not exist as such. They are irregular corridors between mountains of rubble 3 to 4 meters high. The facades of the buildings stand like empty masks. Behind it there is nothing, only columns of air and twisted iron. The smell is that of burnt stone, lime dust, and in the following weeks, that of unrecovered corpses under the rubble. The Reichstag, symbol of the German state, is a smoking shell. Soviet soldiers have planted a red flag on what remains of the roof. The Chancellor of Speer, which the architect designed 7 years earlier with 220 meters of marble gallery designed to impress visitors, is a pile of shattered cornices and split columns. The Brandenburg Gate is still standing but shot, covered with holes. Museum Island, where the world's largest art collections were kept, has been severely damaged. Some works were evacuated earlier, including the Pergamon altar. Others disappeared. The Museum of the Ancient Near East lost part of its Mesopotamian collection. In the last days of the war, the SS General Staff burned part of the art collections that it had not been able to evacuate. The civilians who survived the bombing and the final battle lived in the basements. The ones that had a basement. Those who did not have it lived in the ruins of the ground floors. The water didn't work. The electricity was not working. The gas did not work. The hospitals were still open with what they had, which was very little. Doctors operated by candlelight or flashlights. William Shirer, the American journalist who had covered the Third Reich from the inside as a correspondent and who returned to Germany that fall, described it like this: The people were there, and the land was there. The first dazed, bleeding, hungry, and when winter came, trembling in their rags in the shacks that the bombings had made of their homes. The second, a vast expanse of rubble. Estimates of the total victims of the war in Europe range, according to sources, between 50 and 70 million dead. The Soviet Union alone lost between 20 and 27 million citizens. Poland lost 6 million, 18% of its population. Germany lost between 6 and 8 million military and civilians in combat bombing and exodus from the east. Moreover, during that period, the Nazi regime had systematically murdered 6 million European Jews in what we call the Holocaust. In Nuremberg, judges of the International Military Tribunal, representatives of the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and France, tried survivors of the regime for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The process began on November 20, 1945 and ended on October 1, 1946. It was the first international court in history to judge the leaders of a state for their own actions. It was imperfect, as are all human attempts to bring justice after a crime of that magnitude, but it was. The Third Reich promised 1,000 years and lasted 12, but his legacy, if it can be called that, was longer and deeper than any table of figures can express. The question that Scheirer posed in the preface to his monumental work remains relevant. How was it possible? How did an educated, cultured people with one of the richest philosophical and scientific traditions in Europe follow a man like Hitler to that extent? There is no single answer. There is a constellation of answers: the defeat of 1918 and the grievance of the Treaty of Versailles, the hyperinflation of 1923, which destroyed the savings of the middle class, the Great Depression of 1929, which put 6 million Germans unemployed, the fear of communism among the propertied classes, the structural weakness of the Weimar Republic, Hitler's extraordinary demagoguery, and his ability to exploit all those fears in a synthesis of promises and threats. And also something more difficult to articulate, the human tendency, universal and not specifically German, to delegate moral responsibility to those in charge, to look the other way when what is happening is uncomfortable to see, to stay in the role that the system has assigned you, because stepping out of it requires a courage that most people do not possess in their ordinary lives. Speer, the most intelligent of the Nuremberg defendants, the one who most openly acknowledged his guilt, put it this way in his memoirs, written during the 20 years he spent in Spandau prison: "I lived among murderers for 12 years without thinking about it. Now, at the time of the collapse of the regime, he was about to receive from Hitler himself the moral impulse to attempt to assassinate him." That phrase is one of the most honest testimonies that exists about what the Third Reich did to the people who served it. It turned them into accomplices without many of them seeing it coming. On May 9, 1945, Berlin dawned in silence. It was the first time in years that there had been no gunshots, no explosions, no sirens. The birds sang again in what was left of the trees of the Tiergarten. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. Between his first words, "I too can make history," and his last, "May God protect Germany," the ruins of tens of millions of lives were buried. And the silence of that May morning was not peace. It was the silence that follows when the thunder stops.